Welcome to the ITSP Magazine Podcasts, a modern, innovative multimedia platform broadcasting ideas and connecting minds. You are about to listen to What If Instead podcast with Alejandro Juarez Crawford and Miriam Plavin Masterman. A show about everyday people reimagining the way things work and tackling the obstacles they face. We explore adventures in democratizing innovation, how the chance to try one's hand at something new affects people and even organizations, what powers they discover, and what challenges they face along the way.
Technology is for the people. It should be used for good, not evil. Technology is for the people.
So the curtains behind the brilliant Bob Osborne are something I have to understand before we get into weighty topics. What's the story with your curtains, Osborne?
Those are toile curtains. My wife loves toile, and so there's actually quite a bit more toile that you cannot see in the apartment. The wallpaper is toile. The curtains are toile. There's different toile in my son's bedroom.
Oh, cool! Are there napkins?
Everywhere.
Are there like little? Do we like sneak little bits of toile into a non-toile situation? Right, like you might have a gadget and like a phone, right, and suddenly there's a little ribbon of toile from your phone, or it's not something that appears Amelie style.
I don't think it appears Amelie style. I think it's more like your wallpaper or your curtains, or it's like decorative.
Yeah,
I don't think you'd see it on the
upholstery.
napkins. Yeah, upholstery. Yes, we used to have
Chairs.
wingback chairs that were upholstered in
Yeah.
toile. Yeah.
See, my mind has it like a big fractal at this point where like suddenly parts of your face have like toile pattern sort of, expanding on them, slightly pixelated, but, back and forth image, shaky image. Mim, is this something you've heard of? Am I the only one?
Yeah,
here?
you're the only one. Toile is, it's
This
very
is Mim
French
who has equipment to fold her clothing. Okay, so I should have known.
It's okay. Yes, I have I'm not. I'm ashamed of it. I'm proud of that. But no, toile it's very like specific. You see it all over. I would say often less is more. But the pattern is really pretty. Often it's like very country, but sort of stylized country. And I actually looked it up. It's probably 200 or 300 years old as a style. And it's like people fishing, people, chopping down a tree or sitting under a tree reading. It's all like very cute and pretty. But like in the last, 20 years, people have taken that style and done something sort of subversive and fun with it. So I have a toile in my house. It's called Brooklyn Toile. And they took the idea, it's all done in that toile style, but it's the Coney Island Cyclone. It's a Nathan's Hot Dog, Biggie. Like it's really kind of fun. And so from far away, it looks very formal. But then when you get up close, you realize it's actually something quite different, which is I love that sort of subversive. My husband calls me a Goody Two-Shoes Subversive. I'm like, that's probably accurate. So,
Yeah, Mim, I think you've done something very interesting. You've shown us that we are defined by the eccentricities that we're proud of or ashamed of.
It's very early to be starting with eccentricity.
Says the woman with the clothing folding equipment. So like, this is an eccentricity, as you've just stated, that you're proud of, right? And what was your husband's language you just stated? It was very interesting. You were a Goody Two-Shoes what?
Subversive.
Osborne, are you a Goody Two-Shoes subversive too? Is this what's going on here?
I don't know. I was just thinking
toile?
about whether, the toile is totally my wife, and I'm going to have to tell her about the biggie toile, because it would combine her two biggest loves into one thing.
So I'm right about the fractal. Your whole life is going to have more and more spread of Biggie toile. This is what's happening here.
Yeah.
Sorry, Bob.
It's okay. I think I am a subversive. Am I a Goody Two-Shoes subversive? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could probably be less Goody Two-Shoes about it now that you mention it. I'm going to think about
it's like a 1993 ironic band, right? The Goody Subversives. Go on. What were you saying?
No, I agree. That's a good band name. I like it.
I think I'm going to become a fan, a super fan, maybe a groupie of the Goody Subversives. That's where I fit into all of this.
All right.
So let's do it.
Let's do it. Yes.
I mean, is it our band? Maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I mean,
Let's form this band right now.
no, okay.
Right?
I feel like nobody wants
Ma'am,
to
you
do
play
that.
the ukulele. The Goody
No, I play
Subversives.
no. I play the mandolin. You take that back, Crawford. That is not the same instrument.
I take it back. Retracted, Senator. So like the Goody Subversives definitely has a mandolin player.
Okay.
Clavin Masterman on mandolin.
Okay. We were gonna
Bob,
lose
what are you gonna do in this band? What's your role?
I don't know. You know, vocals maybe. I don't know. But it's been a long time since I sang. So.
And so are these sort of earthy? Are these refrains? Are they spoken word? What are we talking about here?
I don't know. I mean, I feel like if we're subversive, I don't know. Are we like a metal band maybe with a mandolin? I don't know.
Yeah. Because the toile thing, it sounds like it's bucolic, right? So it's to me originally bucolic. That's where I got the earthy thing, right?
Yeah.
But
maybe we're a hardcore band or something. I don't know.
It's got to be a hardcore band. Yeah. But a hardcore band where we all dress like we all have the like Calvin and Hobbes on School Pictures Day haircut that I have, right? Which is on purpose for those watching a video, not seeing a video version of this. I part my hair like one of my Chicano ancestors from like the 20s or 30s, right? And I do that very deliberately because, you know, I'm a little crazy, hopefully in a good way, right? Like, you know, I hope I'm good weird, but I find if my personal appearance is neat, then I'm all right. I used to know a guy who talked in a very Goody Two-Shoes way and dressed super goth. And our theory on him was that the goth dress got people to take him seriously because otherwise his voice was too Goody Two-Shoes for the rest of us.
It's a good strategy. Yeah, I like it.
I'm Alejandro Crawford. My co-host is Mim Plavin Masterman. And we're on a mission to make experiments of your own, not necessarily curtain experiments, but other experiments of your own feel as normal as watching videos on your phone. Welcome to What If Instead.
So we have the pleasure today of being joined by Bob Osborne, who is the principal of the Osborne Group. And they're a boutique consulting firm serving nonprofits. They've been working in this area for about 25 years. They are really big believers in the power of nonprofits and the work that they do. And then also the intersection of philanthropy and nonprofits and how they can work together, in theory, can change the world for something better. And we'll sort of talk about the pros and cons of that whole space and what you've been working in for the past 25 years.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you for having me.
If a wealthy person in a 40% tax bracket gives a $1,000 donation, the government lets them write off 40% or $400. But if I make that same donation, I'm not taxed at 40%. So I only get to write off like $250 because of I'm in a different tax bracket. So from the implication of like it feels like the system's set up to benefit the really wealthy people who can give a lot of money because of how they can deduct it from their taxes.
Yeah, well, there's upper limits on we could sort of, I don't want to get too much into the math, but yes, yeah. I would say overall that is true. I would say, you know, that modern philanthropy exists essentially as a way of preserving wealth and power. You have big robber barons essentially who, you know, their wives gave them something to do, gave them agency that they maybe didn't otherwise have. Yep. It was a sphere where they could exert influence, and it was a way to preserve wealth, to a way to look good in your community. And it was not something that necessarily benefited everyone. It was something that you know, you were much more likely to make donations to organizations that serve people that looked like you, right, or that were in your world, or gave you some kind of you know, personal capital out in the world. I think we see today, even though the not-for-profit system has expanded, and you see, you know, I would argue that it does do a lot of good, but I don't know that we interrogate enough what the origins of philanthropy imply for how philanthropy is conducted today. You know, and I do think, you know, led by the folks at Community Centric Fundraising, that, you know, 4 years ago or so really started to ask those questions in a meaningful sort of way that has gotten the whole sector asking those same questions as well. But yeah, it's set up to benefit the rich. You and I can benefit also, but it's a way of being able to assert, to some level of influence out there in the world, and in a way that is tax deductible. Yes.
So far, we've talked about, you've made the statement, if you're clear about your mission, then you can mitigate some of the pull of where your money came from to some extent. And I want to interrogate that a bit, maybe through those questions that you've just mentioned. You use this phrase, you said, sometimes it makes you more likely to serve the needs of, and these are your words, people that look like you, right? And a big question that Mim and I have raised in our research is whose problems are we solving? And do we, giving the money, even if you're a small donor, you mentioned the three of us or something like that, even understand the situations of the people whose problems most need solving for all of our benefit, or do we need to give more power to them?
Those are big questions. So let me start with the second question, like, who benefits from this? I'm in this business because I genuinely do believe that not-for-profits can and do make a big difference out there in the world. And I do think they're an important part of our system, in the sense that our government really doesn't take care of a lot of the things that many other governments in the world take care of. And so we have this space and this need that needs to be filled through not-for-profits and philanthropy. Then you start to look at, right, well, where does the money go, and how do we even think about that money? I purposely don't use the word charity, because that implies you're just helping someone who's less fortunate for you, independently of sort of the system that created that the less fortune, as opposed to making real social impact in some meaningful sort of way that implies that we're trying to change things, we're trying to make something actually different, we're trying to create a different world, and I think that's really the power of philanthropy. And it shouldn't be reliant on generosity, right? It should be reliant on impact, and making a difference. I do think, that our default, like I was just at a conference last week, the International Fundraising Congress, which is a big fundraising conference that's held every year in the Netherlands. Was with Michelle Murray, who we were presenting on community-centric fundraising. I think people are nervous that this is very different. What's being proposed these days is very different from the way traditional philanthropy is thought about, where it's very donor centric, and it's very much about gratitude towards the donor, and gratitude and being, doing what you can to, keep that donor happy. And I do think good fundraising is very much independent of that. But I would say that, but the way it actually is practiced is often practiced badly, where we give a lot of power to donors, and they have a lot of say in where that money goes. And to your earlier point, it tends to go to specific kinds of causes, like higher education. It goes to a lot of money goes to higher education. Yeah. A lot of money goes to the church. When you're talking about institutions that are really genuinely like making an impact at a social level, it's much less money. Not as much money as you might think really go to communities that are really helping out in some meaningful way beyond what's publicly, beyond public funding.
Since we know you're a toile subversive here, I'm interested in, what were you presenting that could be threatening there?
One, I think we were presenting, really thinking about how we actually approach philanthropy and our fundraising practices. And so they have community-centric fundraising has a few tenets. One of them, is I think most of them are pretty uncontroversial. Like, we within the fundraising world will kind of maybe debate some of them about like what makes good fundraising practice or not, but they're not. I would argue that all the principles really are pretty, make sense. But I think there's maybe a couple that are really challenging. And one is centering, racial and social justice. Like that should be the focus of charity and correcting historical wrongs. That's the one I think that people get hung up on and find challenging. I think you can talk about colonialism. You can talk about, each country, each region has its own version of that in some way. I don't think everything is race focused, but I think very often there are marginalized populations of whatever kind that could be helped by philanthropy, that are not. My other like pet complaint really is just the massive amount of money that just sits around and doesn't do anything. So the amount of money that's just in endowments, of big foundations. Increasingly, people give to this tax benefit called the donor advised fund, which is like maybe the worst thing to happen to philanthropy. People have been debating how bad it is for basically my entire career. But now it's like it's the fastest growing category of giving. I think it's up to like 10 or 15% of all giving goes to DAFs, which is crazy. And anytime you just have these pools of money that are being invested, I find that I don't think it has to be this way, but I find that they tend to become an end in of themselves, and it just becomes investing for investing's sake. The pandemic happened, and surprisingly few foundations spent beyond their 5%, the 5% they're required to spend annually of their principal. Not then. When? When would have been a good time? Mackenzie Scott's trying to spend down her whole fortune, and it takes a long time. And so it makes you wonder, even at the rates she's spending, like, why are we so afraid of spending more than 5%?
This is a problem I'd like to have, but
I wanted to follow up. 6 or 7 years ago, Michael Bloomberg donated almost $2 billion to Johns Hopkins to support need blind admissions, and everybody was like, throwing a party. And then there have been regular videos last several years of like people donating to medical schools, and the medical students are like screaming with joy and all this stuff. But to your point, we're not changing the public policy. We're relying on these magnanimous gifts from philanthropists to solve these huge problems of college being overwhelmingly expensive for a lot of people, and medical school in particular. And I'm listening to you talk about equity and justice. There's a way in which philanthropy and justice are not always aligned. And I guess my example would be volunteering at a soup kitchen or giving money to a soup kitchen isn't going to end hunger, right? So at some level, it's like you're asking the soup kitchen to take on an incentive of self-liquidating, of like putting themselves out of business because we've solved the underlying problem. So that's sort of my bigger question of how much of philanthropy is dealing with these surface symptoms and how much of it is trying to get to the actual causes to almost make the philanthropy unnecessary, either institutional arrangements or policy or whatever.
I don't know that anybody has measured that, but anecdotally, I would say that much of it is treating symptoms, right? I don't think it should be. I think the strongest not-for-profits try to have an impact. I think, that sort of try to have an impact that's beyond just serving, surface problems. But I also think it's hard for them to do that. It's hard to operate at the scale to really have that level of systemic input. You really have to kind of evolve. Most not-for-profits are small and struggling and just trying to solve something in their community or mitigate some problem that they see in their community. And then when you see the systemic investments, they often are done by people who may not be the most qualified to do the work. I mean, I think, like the Gates Foundation, I think means well. But I would also say that, a big part of the reason we have test-driven, education system for so long is because of the Gates Foundation, all the money they put into education. There's good intentions, but there's also like a very serious question of like, how much power do we want to give, these big pools of money, and how much and how interested are they in really changing things.
But if you two will allow me, I've heard these 5 big ideas sort of here, and to some extent we can pick which of them we go into, and they're all related. But one is from your discussion about Teach the Test. It's it's which problems we solve, but it's also which paradigm we bring to those problems, right? And when it's a teach to the test paradigm, right? That's the way traditionally, that's how Gates thinks, if I'm not being too reductive. And that probably works better for malaria than for math. Maybe. 2, I'm not actually weighing in on that. I'm just raising that question. 2 is, where is the preponderance of resources applied? And these are questions that bring up the big question number 3, which is, who are we asking, right? Not just who has the purse strings, which we've already started talking, but who defines the problem, the paradigm, and even the way we think about solving it? Because Mim and I are writing a book about how, as long as we ask the same people, instead of those folks you started to touch on who might be in the global south, understanding breast cancer awareness in the culture of Accra, as one of our guests on What If Instead has talked about, then we're not going to be able to solve this problem. That brings us to the 4th, which, Bob, you brought up this very interesting piece when you said, if we're just focused on helping the less fortunate, and we do that independent of the systems that made their misfortune predictable, then we may actually just always be fritting around the edges, right? If we're measurement based, then we're always focused on being able to get a direct result. We tend to move away from enabling models that can enable lots of people to resourcefully solve their own problems. Bob, how do you think about these interlocking pieces?
And I think the folks at Community-Centric Fundraising have done a pretty good job of sort of putting out an alternative paradigm about how to be thinking about this work. So one is centering the social justice and racial justice and making that a core part of what every organization does in some way. To have, to at least be thinking about that and thinking about how does our work actually have some impact on those that are less fortunate in society in some way. So your average not-for-profit, right, is going to, let's say I'm a food bank in this community, right? And I'm the big player, the food bank. And then within my community, there's these smaller organizations that work on the ground and are doing, also doing, work around housing and other like causes of not being able to eat, right? Mm-hmm. And you have this whole ecosystem, right, that it theoretically exists to solve the same problem, except because of the fact that I need to fundraise and philanthropy and the way that philanthropy is sort of approached, I, as like the big food bank, might just hoover up all the money that's available, to all these other organizations. And maybe I'm doing an awesome job and I redistribute it, which would be great. But maybe I'm not doing that. Maybe I'm just, I'm going to run programs for my sake. I'm going to duplicate the programs that these other organizations are running. I'm essentially going to put them out of business, right? Because I'm doing the work. And then, so the question becomes, are we centering the mission of our organization, or are we centering the community itself? Mm-hmm. And so the proposal is to really center the community and really ask yourself, are we beyond mission? That the mission, your mission statement shouldn't be primary, but be thinking about how can I have the most impact in the community, even if that means deferring gifts, re-granting gifts to other organizations, redirecting money to organizations that might be doing that better, some specific task better than you, but really starting to think about, are we actually helping the people that we say that we're helping, or do we just exist as a bureaucracy that exists for its own sake, does do some good in the world, but is not really thinking about the systemic problems? The first question we have to ask ourselves is like, are we helping people? Are we making a difference? Are we changing these systems that create these problems in the first place, or are we just kind of giving people money around the edges and not thinking about this, in a holistic sort of? Going back to Gates for a second, Microsoft is a huge investor in OpenAI, for example. If their dreams are realized, going to be a massive environmental problem potentially. So if we don't think about like a lot of times we think about it like we're going to create this whole new problem, right? And then we're going to donate a fraction of that money back into the system to like mitigate the problem that we caused in the first place. What makes the most sense in terms of investing? How can we as foundations or as major donors or as lots of small donors really invest in an actual impact of some kind and try to solve systemic problems, which I think we could do if the will was there to do it. The money is there. Again, we're sitting on many, many billions of dollars that we could unleash to solve, problems.
How would we do it? How would we? I just want to fixate on, you said, I think we could do that experimentally. You don't have to have all the answers. What would we start trying to do?
I think these foundations. So one, we'd get rid of DAFs probably. So the money is not just locked up. And because it's, for those people who don't know what a DAF is, I mean, basically I donate to my own donor advised fund. I get a tax deduction today. And now I have my tax deduction. So there's not a lot of incentive for me to now distribute that money to charities because I've already given it to a charity, me, essentially my donor advised fund. Now, people will make donations from that, but a lot of the money, sits around, it gets invested, with institutional investors. And I think that is a big problem. I think foundations sit on a lot of money that they don't need to be sitting on. They could ask themselves the question of, how did we get our money? Do we owe anything back to the communities that 99% of the time we probably exploited or was extractive in some particular way? Some of these are very much existential issues, and so why are we just sitting on all this capital that we could deploy in ways that are interesting? We could run genuine experiment. Appeasing.
But what would have to change to run genuine experiments? And I see that, Mim, you have a burning question, but let me hold that question. Go on.
I think it would really just be a change in attitude about the way, at least, foundations thought about it, and foundations represent a pretty big chunk of philanthropy. I think individuals represent a much larger part of that. I think if you're a small little organization that's unproven in some way, you're not getting money. If you're run by the people that you serve, you're not going to get money because people give to what they know and who they know. And I'm speaking very broadly. I'm not saying this never happens.
Yeah.
But it could happen at a much higher, much larger scale than it does.
It seems to me that there's an accountability issue, and two, it seems to me that there's a transparency issue. And that both of these are related to some of the stickiness of the philanthropy problem. So when I was preparing for this, I did a little bit of research. I looked up, there are about 100,000 private foundations in the U.S. 90% of them have no website, which is kind of amazing. So there's all this money, but there's like no way to even find out who's running these foundations. Then I'm sure you already know this, Bob, but for our listeners, you can't be unelected for the most part in a foundation. Like, they're relatively unaccountable, especially if it's like your family foundation. There's not really like a competitor who's going to put you out of business. And to your point, there's no incentive to spend your money down to self-liquidate and put yourself out of business. So all of that to me says that one of the things that we need to think about if we're really going to make systemic change is how to increase accountability or how to increase transparency. And I guess the way I would frame the question is it a policy question? Is it an incentive question? Like, is it carrot or stick? Is it both? And then if so, what's the carrot and what's the stick?
You could get rid of DAFs. You could have requirements of spending more than, your 5% requisite, spending. I think you could, on the transparency question, if anything, we're probably moving towards less transparency in these matters than more transparency. Unfortunately, I mean, foundations do have to file a 990, which does provide some information about it, but it's not easy to find those. From that perspective, yeah, I mean, it's your own money, right? Like, that's the way we work here in the United States. There's not a lot of accountability with how where money goes and how it flows and who it flows to. I do think that we, in the not-for-profit sector, can be more transparent and encourage people to be more transparent. I mean, I think that's something as a sector we aren't as good at as we probably could be on that accountability question. But, I do think you could do any number of tax law reforms that just make it, that would incentivize people to, or force them to spend more of their money. That if you're going to get this tax deduction, that's fine, but you need to spend it on the public good at a rate that is higher than people are currently spending. And your money would still last for a really, really long time. Right. It would last for a really, really long time.
So to me, there's a twofold measurement question related to accountability. If one is, if we're so focused on measuring the thing, maybe we're missing what's really the problem, which is one piece. But the second is, we can make this foundation look like it's doing a lot if we make the numbers look a certain way. If we ask a question a certain way versus a different way, we can show a lot of on paper progress also without getting to the root of the problem. So that still seems to be like an accountability issue of how do you really know that they're helping people?
I can only think of like one not-for-profit that measures really, 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 really well. Everyone else is like apples to oranges year to year. It's one of those things where people want to hear it. There's this sort of movement towards accountability. I would say, it's somewhat driven by the money that's coming out of like Silicon Valley and sort of that way of thinking, like everything needs to be measured. If you wanted to be rigorous about measuring, you'd almost have to start, you'd have to become like a think tank or you'd have some division of your organization that's like just focused on this. And some organizations do have people that are dedicated to it because they genuinely want to know for themselves whether they're being effective or not. But I think most organizations find the level of measurement burdensome in a way that because it's not rigorous. And so it's just burdensome for its own, for its own sake. I'm speaking broadly because there are foundations out there that really do take it seriously, talking to people within the community, understanding what's going on in the community, not relying on their own expertise, but relying on what people within the community are actually saying that they need and want. And I think if you look at like developmental organizations, like aid organizations, there's a real power shift that most of them are doing at this point to like really leave the decision making and questions of effectiveness to the folks that are on the ground. But that could be adopted by many more parts of the sector. That could be adopted with more rigor. And I think a lot of organizations, over the last 4 years have sort of asked this question but I haven't really seen meaningful change, because at the end of the day, like, you don't have to be accountable to anyone, right? Like, it's my money. I'm going to do what I want with it. And that's the system.
I just co-created a nonprofit, and we have the head of data for a for-profit company on our board very intentionally. And maybe that's something, there are a lot of data scientists being released into the workforce right now. Maybe that's not crazy. But I actually am going to be selective and focus on really 4 words. You said 5 words. You said they're not getting the money. And you were talking about if you're a small organization, and especially if you're from the served community. And then you said those words, they're not getting the money. And I want to focus on that because one of the things that Mim and I work a lot on is resourcefulness, resilience, capacity building, all the things that happen as an effect of creating your own solutions in a community, in an industry. Right? All the little relationships and trades and skills that get built up as you do this. And when I heard you say they're not getting the money, I had these alarm bells going off in my head. So hold on. All the capacity to solve these problems is outside the community. Can you give us any crazy ideas that you have on how we could change that?
I think if you look at like the community-centric model, which really focuses on the relationship between not-for-profits and themselves, we could take that further. We could really take a look at like a what I would call an ecosystem model, where you match capital, you match competencies, you have these volunteers that are data scientists that that understand how to do, whatever within the community, that are lawyers, that, have professional expertise of whatever kind, that have content expertise of whatever kind. You have different not-for-profits that understand, that have a shared vision for what they want to have in the community and a shared understanding of what role each might play, and through community mapping, exercise. And people are thinking about this. People are experimenting with this. I don't know that. I think it's too soon to see where things are going. I think we're sort of still in the developing. What is this? What does this look like? But I think that would be a great model. Really thinking about just bringing in, however you want to define a community. Who are all the players in the community? What capital is available? What expertise is available? And let's solve some problems together rather than competing against each other for, what is perceived as scarce resources. Even within the existing system, I think if we cooperated more and really had that mentality, because right now we're not, I come out of fundraising. I'm judged by how much money I raise for my organization, not for your organization, not for the community, not for solving problems, just pure money. How much money can I, and I'm good if I can raise the money, and I'm bad if I don't raise the money. And we could define that differently. And we look at that at some of the federated organizations that we work with that have a national office and affiliates, and start to experiment a little bit. We're well, what if you did get, if you just help the whole federated organization, shouldn't you get credit for that? So you start to see those kind of examples. You start to see organizations now that are re-granting, that are turning down grants sometimes in favor, but recommending a smaller organization. So I think at least within a certain number of progressive organizations that I think people are thinking about this, and we need to kind of switch the mentality of my sector, and how we think about these problems.
I want to close on that note, because I think those questions you asked really give those of us interested in changing these outcomes food for thought. I want to thank you, Bob. You can add any closing bon mots, you and your toile curtains, if you want. But let me just say thank you so much for helping us think about the crazy stuff we could do that might just be incredibly sane.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun. And yeah, thanks for giving me a forum to just vent all the the things that I'm thinking about in my world. But yeah, it was a lot of fun.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of What If Instead podcast with Alejandro Juarez Crawford and Miriam Plavin Masterman. If you liked this story, add this show to your favorite podcast player and share What If Instead podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to connect your brand to this show and its audience, visit itspmagazine.com to learn how to sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey.